The human soldiers were being torn to shreds. Their screams of agony echoed over the blood-soaked battlefields of planet Zephyria as the ruthless Breen insectoids ripped them apart. The humans were losing this war badly. Defeat seemed inevitable. Hope was almost lost. Bruce Simmons, grizzled commander of Earth's dwindling forces, crouched in a bombed-out bunker. Shellfire thundered around him. He gripped his plasma rifle, knuckles white. The situation was beyond dire. The Breen controlled the high ground, the orbital lanes. Their advanced tech and hive-mind coordination overwhelmed the humans at every turn. Colony defenses were crumbling. Civilian casualties mounted daily. Bruce had one last desperate gambit to try and save his species from extermination on this planet. It was a suicide mission. Infiltrate the Breen mothership in orbit, disable their psionic amplifier that allowed the Breen Queen to control her warriors, and send a distress call to Earth, a plea for them to send the forbidden ancient Warbeasts, genetically engineered killing machines from humanity's dark past, once used to crush entire alien civilizations, but now outlawed by galactic treaties Earth had signed in more peaceful times. Treaties be damned. The Breen were on the verge of wiping out every last man, woman and child on Zephyria. This was no time to play by the rules. The humans needed the sheer ferocity and brutality of the Warbeasts to have any prayer of survival. Bruce would do whatever it took to get that message out, even at the cost of his own life. The mothership had to be sabotaged. The Warbeasts had to be unleashed, or every human on this planet would perish in shrieking, agonizing death. He checked his weapon one last time and slipped out of the bunker into the apocalyptic hellscape that Zephyria had become, toward the most important and fateful mission of his life. All of humanity's future here hung in the balance. Light years away on Earth, a chime sounded in the office of Admiral Nora Hawkins. She jolted upright in her chair, spilling coffee on a stack of reports. Nora slammed the intercom button. "What's happening?" "Admiral, we've received a distress call from Commander Bruce Simmons on Zephyria. The Breen have them on the ropes. He says he needs the Warbeasts, ma'am." "Patch it through now." Nora listened intently, her face darkening as she heard Bruce's desperate plea, punctuated by the sounds of explosions and screams. Her top Special Forces commander painted a grim picture. The Breen's psionic amplifier was allowing their queen to coordinate and enhance her forces to devastating effect. The humans were being slaughtered. It was only a matter of time before the colony fell completely and every colonist was butchered. "God damn it," Nora growled. The Warbeasts. Abominations from a darker age, before humanity developed a conscience. Packs of massively engineered dire wolves, all muscle, fang and fury, strong enough to rip through tank armor, fast enough to outrun hoverbikes. And smart, terribly smart. Earth had signed treaties promising to never use them again after their bloody rampages in the Centauri War. But Bruce was right. Without the Warbeasts, Zephyria was doomed. And Nora would be damned if she'd let millions die just to keep a promise to the pencil pushers on Galactic Council. She punched in her override codes, accessing the cryo vault buried deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain. "Get me the Fenris pack." Within an hour, a menacing black spacecraft shot out of Earth orbit, rapidly accelerating towards the besieged planet, the ESS Shadowfang. On board, a dozen cryopods hissed open, wisps of freezing fog billowing out. Massive pores flexed, yellow eyes flicked open, pupils narrowing. The Fenris pack was awake and hungry. In the center pod, the largest of the beasts shook off the ice crystals matting his shaggy fur. Muscles rippled across his flanks as he stretched his enormous frame. A scar bisected one cloudy eye. This was Odin, the Alpha, the smartest, the strongest, the most vicious. He growled low in his throat, a sound that promised blood and fire. The speaker crackled. "Odin, this is Admiral Hawkins. The human colony on Zephyria needs you. Countless lives are at stake. You must protect our people at any cost. Kill anything that threatens them. Show no mercy to our enemies. Unleash hell." A glint of understanding lit the Warbeast's eyes. Protect, kill, unleash hell. These concepts Odin knew well. These he lived for. He threw back his head and howled, a terrifying sound that was as much of a war cry as a baying of the hounds. The hunt was on. The rest of the pack joined in, filling the ship with their chilling chorus. They were ready to fulfill their purpose, the reason they'd been created, to rend and tear humanity's foes limb from limb, to paint the stars red. Zephyria would be their proving ground, and the Breen would learn to fear the big bad wolves. Bruce primed the antimatter charge, preparing to end this threat once and for all. But just as he was about to set the explosive, an ominous clicking filled the air, insectoid feet scrabbling on metal, hundreds of them. Dronox warriors poured into the chamber from every entrance, plasma rifles leveled at the humans, and behind them, eyes seething with rage, was Queen Korvac herself. "Destroy the amplifier!" Bruce roared to his team as he opened fire on the Dronox. Plasma bolts crisscrossed the chamber as both sides unleashed hell, but there were too many. Bruce watched in despair as several of his men went down screaming, sheared in half by the aliens' razor-sharp appendages. With a final defiant yell, Bruce hurled the antimatter charge at the sphere. The amplifier exploded in a blinding flash, shockwaves hurling Bruce and the surviving humans against the walls. Korvac shrieked in pain, clutching her head. The light in her eyes flickered erratically as she lost the focus the amplifier provided. Bruce dragged himself to his feet, glaring at Korvac as her elite guards closed in. "It's over, bug bitch," he snarled, raising his rifle. "You're done controlling your little drones." She lashed out with a psionic blast, the force of her will slamming Bruce to his knees. His vision swam as her power bored into his mind, a million insects skittering through his brain. He felt her psionic tendrils clawing at his consciousness, trying to subsume it. But Bruce was a stubborn bastard. He'd held the line against the Breen for months. He'd watched countless comrades die. He'd bled and suffered and sacrificed to protect his people. He wouldn't fall now, not to this alien abomination. With a mental scream of rage and agony, he drove Korvac out, shattering her psionic grip. She reeled back, mandibles clacking in disbelief. Bruce raised his head, teeth gritted in a feral smile. "Gonna have to do better than that, bitch." He staggered upright, sweeping his rifle in an arc, unleashing a hail of plasma into the Dronox. Chitin cracked, ichor sprayed, insectoid bodies crumpled. His surviving men rallied, pouring fire into the alien throng. The amplifier's destruction had thrown the Breen forces into disarray, disrupting their coordination. But Korvac's fury knew no bounds. She drew deep from her well of psionic power, even as it bucked and heaved within her mind, without the amplifier to harness it. She would rip the reason from these humans' primitive brains, turn them into drooling cattle before she allowed them to escape. The air crackled with eldritch energy as she launched bolt after bolt of psychic lightning at Bruce, trying to boil him alive within his own skull. He dropped to one knee, teeth clenched as blood ran from his nose. His men screamed as her power found them too, synapses scorched by her wrath. Bruce knew they had to get off this ship. His mission was complete, the amplifier was scrap, but that would mean nothing if they fell to Korvac here. Earth still needed that warning, still needed the Warbeasts. Bruce would not fail, could not fail. Reaching deep within himself, he shoved back against Korvac's assault, using every ounce of willpower he had left. He raised his rifle in shaking hands, aiming at the damaged bulkhead behind the Breen. The hull was cracked, warped by the antimatter blast. One good shot. The bulkhead exploded outward as Bruce's plasma bolt struck home. Hurricane whines ripped through the chamber as the ship's atmo vented into space. Dronox warriors were sucked out, spiraling into the void. Korvac shrieked in rage as she dug her claws into the deck, fighting the pull of vacuum. "Go!" Bruce shouted to his men. "Get to the shuttle, I'll cover you." Anchoring himself against a girder, he raked the Dronox with plasma, cutting down the aliens as they struggled in the vortex. His team scrambled for the gaping hole, mag boots clanging. One by one they vanished into the star-flecked darkness. Only Bruce remained. alone against the might of the hive. But he had done his duty. His men would escape. Earth would be warned. The Warbeasts would come. Zephyria had a fighting chance. Tossing aside his empty rifle, he drew his vibro knife, the adamantium blade humming. Korvac loomed before him, eyes blazing with insane hate. Her psionic power crackled around her, barely restrained. She would splatter his mind across the cosmos. Bruce spat blood onto the deck and raised his knife. "Come on then, bitch, let's dance." With a chitinous roar, Korvac surged towards him, talons extended. Her mind lashed at his, burrowing, scouring. Bruce leapt to meet her, the battle cry of humanity on his lips. They collided in a maelstrom of flashing blades and psychic fire, two avatars of their species' determination to survive, to conquer. The fate of Zephyria and all mankind hung in the balance. Bruce parried Korvac's slashing talons, the razor-sharp tips sparking off his vibro knife. The insectoid queen pressed her relentless assault, her psionic power lashing at Bruce's mind even as they dueled. He could feel her malevolent will clawing at the edges of his consciousness, seeking a weakness, trying to shred his sanity. But even as he grappled with Korvac, a flicker of movement caught Bruce's eye. A group of ragged figures darted across the war-torn deck, dodging blasts of plasma and showers of chitin. Bruce's heart leapt as he recognized the lead figure, Jake, his brother, long thought lost to the Breen. The prisoners he'd freed were making a break for the escape pods. Jake paused, looking back at Bruce. Their eyes met across the chaos. A lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. Then Jake held up a hand, something glinting in his grasp. Bruce squinted. It was a vial, filled with a strange, luminous liquid. Jake mimed throwing it, then pointed at Korvac. His meaning was clear. With a final nod, Jake turned and sprinted after the other prisoners. Bruce knew his brother was a genius xenobiologist. If anyone could find a chink in the Breen's armor, literally or figuratively, it was Jake. But to do that, he needed a sample of Korvac herself, and Bruce was going to get it for him. Gritting his teeth against the psionic onslaught, Bruce lunged at Korvac, feinting high then slashing low. His blade bit into her thorax, ichor spraying. The queen shrieked in pain and rage, her mind blast redoubled, threatening to pulverize Bruce's brain within his skull. He staggered, vision blurring, the knife falling from nerveless fingers. Korvac loomed over him, her mandibles dripping venom. She raised her talons for the killing blow. Bruce closed his eyes, preparing for the end. But the blow never fell. A deafening roar shook the chamber as the far wall exploded inward. Shards of metal scythed through the air, and through the smoke and fire a monstrous shape emerged. Odin had arrived. The alpha warbeast was a titan, all fangs and fury. His claws gouged the deck, his jaws slavered. His eyes, one milky with scar tissue, the other filled with feral cunning, fixed on Korvac. He had the scent of his prey. Behind him, the rest of the Fenris pack poured into the chamber, a tide of engineered killing machines. They fell upon the Dranox with savage glee, ripping and tearing with brutal efficiency. Breen warriors were shredded like paper, their weapons useless against the Warbeast's hide. Korvac spun to face this new threat, mandibles clacking in disbelief. Her control over the Dranox faltered as the mental feedback from their violent deaths slammed into her mind. She lashed out with a psionic shockwave, trying to crush the Warbeast's simple minds. But Odin was no mere beast. He was the product of Earth's most advanced military science, his brain enhanced to near-human levels. Korvac's mental blast broke upon his iron will like water on rock. With a snarl, he launched himself at the queen, claws outstretched. There, Korvac's ichor splattered on the deck. With a trembling hand, Bruce scooped a gobbet of the viscous fluid into an empty shell casing. It would have to do. He had to get this to Jake and pray his brother could work a miracle. Clutching his prize, Bruce staggered toward the escape pods where he'd seen Jake and the others flee. Behind him, Odin and Korvac raged, two apex predators locked in mortal combat. The fate of Zephyria would be decided here, in blood and fire. Bruce tumbled into the escape pod, his strength spent. Jake was there, helping him, taking the shell casing. The doors slammed shut. The pod blasted free of the disintegrating mothership. And on the planet below, the tide of battle turned as the Fenris pack fell upon the Breen like the wrath of old Earth. The Breen's coordination crumbled without Korvac's focused will. The Warbeasts' savagery was unstoppable. Dronok's warriors fell by the score, their hive mind thrown into chaos. In the makeshift lab of the human HQ, Jake worked feverishly, synthesizing, testing, praying. Bruce's sample was the key, the Breen's weakness, hidden in their genetic code, a vulnerability to a rare Earth compound, a poison to the Breen, harmless to humans. Within hours, the skies of Zephyria darkened with dropships, as Earth forces rained from orbit. Every soldier was armed with Jake's miracle weapon, chemical bombs and armor-piercing rounds laced with the Breen bane. The Breen's exoskeletons crumbled like sand. Their ships dissolved in mid-air. The Dronoks died in droves, their bodies rejecting their own poisoned flesh. It was a rout, a slaughter. Zephyria ran red with insectoid ichor, and leading the charge, baying for alien blood, was the Fenris pack. Odin had returned alone, his fur matted with the Queen's gore. Korvac was no more. The hive mind was broken. The Breen were beaten. The ESS Shadowfang's sleek black hull sliced through the void of Zephyrian space, its cloaking tech shielding it from the Breen's sensors. On the bridge, Admiral Nora Hawkins hailed the beleaguered human colony. In the Shadowfang's drop bay, the Fenris pack paced restlessly, their massive frames rippling with barely contained aggression. Odin stood at the head of the pack, his scarred muzzle lifted as he scented the recycled air. The sharp tang of propellant, the electric crackle of energy weapons, the musk of his packmates. To him, these were the scents of war, of the hunt. The deck shuddered as the ship hit Atmo. The drop bay doors yawned open, revealing the roiling clouds and flashes of orbital bombardment below. Odin threw his head back in a haunting howl, a sound that resonated in the souls of his pack. As one, they surged forward, leaping from the ship into the maelstrom of battle. They fell like meteors, their grav harnesses controlling their descent. Odin hit the ground first, his claws gouging the blood-soaked earth. The rest of the pack landed around him, their impact craters encircling his like a summoning ritual. Before them, a sea of Dronoks swarmed towards the human lines, plasma scything through the air. The Zephyrian defenders were crumbling, their weapons ineffective against the chitinous hide of the Breen. Odin snarled, a sound like grinding boulders. Then he charged, his pack fanning out behind him in a wedge formation. They hit the Dronoks line like a tidal wave, unstoppable, crushing everything in their path. Odin's jaws clamped around a Dronoks warrior, his teeth punching through the exoskeleton like it was paper. He wrenched his head, ripping the insectoid in half in a spray of ichor. His packmates fell upon the Breen with equal savagery, their claws and fangs tearing through the alien's armor like it was nothing. The Zephyrians watched in awe as the Warbeasts carved a path of destruction through the enemy ranks. Bolstered by the sight, they rallied, charging forward with renewed vigor. Grenades laced with Jake's Breenbane compounds arced into the fray, exploding in clouds of deadly gas. The Dronoks warriors staggered, their exoskeletons melting, their coordination faltering as the toxin ravaged their systems. In the heart of the Breen lines, Odin raged, a force of nature implacable and terrifying. Dronoks fell before him in droves, torn asunder by his claws, crushed by his jaws. The ground grew slick with their blood, a cloying stench that only drove the Fenris pack to greater heights of fury. Above the carnage, in the mothership's ruined Sci amplifier chamber, Bruce Simmons fought for his life and his sanity. Korvac's psionic onslaught hammered at his mind, seeking to shred his consciousness, to remake him as a drooling thrall. He could feel her malevolent will worming through his thoughts, a rot spreading through his brain. His body was battered, broken, barely responsive to his commands. Each breath was agony, each movement a Herculean effort. But still he fought, drawing on reserves of willpower he didn't know he possessed. For Earth, for Zephyria, for the brother he'd thought lost. Jake worked frantically at the chamber's control panel, his fingers flying over the keys. He was trying to isolate the frequency of Korvac's psionic emissions to find a way to jam them. But the Breen systems were alien, inscrutable. He was running out of time. Bruce's vision was tunneling, his mind fraying at the edges. Korvac loomed over him, her eyes pits of alien hunger, her will an implacable force. She was inside him, violating his very sense of self. He could feel himself slipping away, his identity subsumed into the seething hive of her consciousness. "Got it!" Jake shouted triumphantly. He slammed his hand down on the jury-rigged psionic dampener, a cobbled-together mess of human and Breen tech. A pulse of counter-resonant energy surged through the chamber. Korvac reeled back, shrieking in agony, her psionic tendrils retracting from Bruce's mind like scorched worms. Bruce gasped, his mind suddenly blessedly his own again. He staggered to his feet, snatching up the fallen anti-Breen weapon. Korvac writhed before him, her psionic powers flickering and spasming as the dampener disrupted her control. With a roar of defiance and desperation, Bruce charged. He rammed the barrel of the weapon into a crack in Korvac's exoskeleton, a weak point exposed by her thrashing. He pulled the trigger. A blast of Breenbane compounds pumped directly into Korvac's body cavity. She convulsed, her scream rising to a mind-shattering crescendo, her exoskeleton blackened, dissolving, sloughing away in caustic sheets. Bruce kept firing until the weapon clicked empty, until Korvac was nothing more than a twitching mound of liquefied flesh. The Queen was dead. All across the mothership the Breen faltered, their coordination dissolving as the synapse creature that was their hive mind collapsed into gibbering fragments. Dronok's warriors went into spasms, clutching at their heads, their weapons forgotten. On the planet below, the tide turned with finality. The Breen lines shattered, the insectoids scattering like leaves before a hurricane. The Zephyrians and the Fenris pack fell upon them, the slaughter cathartic, righteous. The escape pods jettisoned from the disintegrating Breen mothership, streaking towards the surface of Zephyria like shooting stars. Inside, Bruce and Jake clung to the crash webbing, the adrenaline of their narrow escape still pumping through their veins. The other survivors, the ragged band of prisoners they'd freed, huddled in the cramped confines of the pods, hardly daring to believe they were finally free of their Breen tormentors. The pods hit the atmosphere, the heat of re-entry enveloping them in a cocoon of fire. Bruce gritted his teeth as the G-forces pressed him back into his seat, the pod shaking and rattling around him. He glanced over at Jake, saw the same grim determination etched on his brother's face. They'd come this far. They would not fail now. With a bone-jarring impact, the pod slammed into the ground, digging furrows in the war-torn earth. The hatches blew open, and Bruce and Jake staggered out, blinking in the sudden light. Around them, the other pods disgorged their human cargo, the survivors stumbling out onto the blood-soaked soil of Zephyria. A ragged cheer went up from the assembled Zephyrian defenders as they saw their long-lost comrades emerging from the pods. The cheer swelled to a roar as the Fenris pack loped into view, their fur matted with Breen ichor, their jaws dripping with the blood of their foes. Odin, the massive alpha, threw back his head and howled, a sound of victory and defiance that echoed across the battlefield. Bruce and Jake were swept up in a tide of jubilant humans, the survivors of the Breen occupation, embracing their rescuers with tears of joy. For a moment, the horrors of the past months were forgotten, washed away in the euphoria of their deliverance. But the celebration was short-lived. A priority communication from Admiral Hawkins cut through the cheers like a knife. Her holographic image flickered to life, her face grave. "Commander Simmons, I have urgent news. Our long-range sensors have detected a massive Breen reinforcement fleet en route to Zephyria. They're being led by Warlord Zalax, Korvac's mate. He's sworn revenge for her death." Bruce's blood ran cold. Zalax was a legend among the Breen, a ruthless tactician and a merciless warrior. If he was coming to Zephyria, it could only mean one thing: total annihilation of the human presence on the planet. He looked around at the ragged, exhausted defenders, at the battered remains of the colony. Even with the Fenris pack, they were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. They had no hope of standing against the might of a full Breen war fleet. Unless... An idea began to form in Bruce's mind, a desperate, dangerous gambit. He turned to Jake, his eyes alight with a feverish intensity. The psionic dampener, the one you used on Korvac, can you modify it, amplify its effects? Jake frowned, his brow furrowing. Amplify it? To what end? The Breen are a hive mind, their greatest strength but also their greatest weakness. If we could project our thoughts, our emotions, directly into their collective consciousness, it might be enough to overwhelm them, to shatter their unity. Jake's eyes widened, a psychic assault, using their own psionic network against them. A slow smile spread across his face. It's brilliant. Insane, but brilliant. It might just work. They set to work at once. Jake and his team of xenotech experts huddled over the dampener, modifying, tweaking, coaxing more power from its alien circuitry. Bruce assembled a strike team, the best of the best, to deliver this new weapon into the heart of the enemy fleet. As the Breen ships darkened the skies above Zephyria, the ESS Shadowfang sliced through the chaos of the orbital battle, its cloaking field shimmering. On board, Bruce and his team prepped their weapons, checked their gear, steeled themselves for the fight to come. Beside them, the modified psionic device thrummed with barely contained power, a sliver of alien technology that held the fate of an entire world within its circuits. The Shadowfang glided silently through the Breen formation, the insectoid ships looming like monstrous hives around it. Bruce waited, his hand hovering over the dampener's activation switch, as Jake counted down the distance. Bruce slammed his hand down on the switch. The dampener pulsed, a wave of psychic energy bursting from its core and washing over the Breen fleet. Every human thought, every human emotion, every scrap of memory and feeling and sensation, all of it amplified 1,000-fold and hurled directly into the core of the Breen hive mind. For a moment there was silence. The Breen ships hung motionless in space as if frozen in time. Then as one they began to convulse. Dronok's warriors thrashed in their harnesses, their mandibles frothing, their compound eyes rolling. Warlord Zalax writhed on the bridge of his flagship, his psionic will straining to hold his suddenly fractured swarm together. The human minds aboard the Shadowfang reeled as the backlash of the psychic assault slammed into them. They had no defense against the sudden influx of alien thoughts and emotions, a riotous cacophony of inhuman sensations that threatened to drown their own identities. Bruce clung to the console, his mind a whirlwind of Breen memories, Breen instincts, Breen hungers. He could feel the hive pressing in on him, trying to subsume him, to erase all that made him human. He fought back with every fiber of his being, focusing on his own memories, his own emotions, his love for his brother, his dedication to his people, his unbreakable will to survive. Slowly, painfully, he pushed the alien presence back, reasserting his own mind, his own self. Around him the rest of the team were doing the same, their faces contorted with effort, their bodies shaking with the strain. In the heart of the Breen fleet, chaos reigned. Ships careened out of formation, colliding with each other in showers of sparks and debris. Dronok's warriors turned on each other, mandibles flashing, claws ripping into chitinous flesh. The once unified swarm had shattered into a maddened frenzy of individual insects, their hive mind fractured beyond repair. And at the center of it all, Warlord Zalax howled in impotent rage, his psionic dominion crumbling around him. He lashed out with his mind, trying to reassert control, but it was like trying to hold sand in a clenched fist. The more he struggled, the more his swarm slipped away. Aboard the Shadowfang, Bruce watched the Breen fleet tearing itself apart, a grim smile on his face. The gambit had worked. The hive was broken. Zephyria was safe. But even as the thought formed, a lance of psionic energy slammed into the Shadowfang's hull, sending the ship reeling. On the viewscreen, the twisted visage of Warlord Zalax leered at them, his eyes blazing with madness and hate. "Humans," he spat, his voice a chitinous rasp. "You think you've won, you think you've broken us, fools. I am the swarm, I am the hive. and I will see your world burn for what you've done." With a snarl, Xalax's flagship surged forward, its prow aimed directly at the Shadowfang. Bruce shouted for evasive action, but it was too late. The Breen ship slammed into them, the impact sending crewmen sprawling. Alarms blared, consoles sparked and smoked. The psionic blast slammed into the Breen fleet, a tsunami of raw human emotion and memory. It ripped through the ordered lattice of the hive mind, shattering the very core of Breen identity. Dronok's warriors reeled, clutching at their heads as unfamiliar sensations flooded their consciousness. Individuality, free will, concepts utterly alien to the Breen. On the bridge of his ship, a Dronok's commander twitched and convulsed, his mind bombarded by a relentless barrage of human experience. The love of a parent for a child, the agony of loss, the fierce joy of victory. Each thought was a searing lance, piercing the veil of the hive mind. With a chittering scream, the commander turned on his own crew, mandibles snapping, claws slashing. The bridge dissolved into a whirlwind of frenzied combat as Breen turned on Breen, unable to cope with the psychic maelstrom that engulfed them. Across the fleet, the scene repeated itself. Breen ships careened out of formation, some firing on their own allies in the confusion. The once unified armada had been reduced to a milling swarm of maddened individuals. But on the flagship, Warlord Xalax stood firm against the psychic onslaught. His will was a fortress, his mind a citadel that would not bend. He drew his most loyal warriors to him, those whose mental conditioning was strongest. They formed a bulwark of disciplined thought around him, a levee against the rising tide of chaos. "Target that ship," Xalax snarled, stabbing a claw at the Shadowfang. "Burn it from my sky." The flagship's weapons powered up, plasma torpedoes glowing in their tubes. With a flash of actinic light, they hurled towards the human vessel. On the Shadowfang's bridge, alarms blared as the sensor officer shouted a warning. Bruce lunged for the helm, wrenching the ship into a desperate evasive pattern. The torpedoes shot past, near misses that rocked the ship with their proximity detonations. But the psionic device, the linchpin of their strategy, had been hit. Sparks fountained from its housing, its hum turning to a sickly whine. The flood of human thought that had been pouring into the Breen hive mind slowed to a trickle, then guttered out entirely. On the planet below, the tide of battle had turned. The colonial defenders, heartened by the disarray in the Breen ranks, surged forward. Plasma fire lit the night as human and insectoid clashed in a brutal melee. At the forefront of the charge was Odin, the alpha warbeast. His fur was matted with ichor, his jaws dripping with alien blood. He led the Fenris pack in a headlong assault on the Breen command post, a fortress bristling with plasma cannons and swarming with Dronok's elites. The dire wolves hit the Breen lines like a thunderbolt, scattering the insectoids like chaff before a hurricane. Odin ripped through a knot of Dronok's warriors, his claws finding the weak points in their exoskeletons with uncanny precision. The pack spread out, harrying the defenders, drawing their fire away from the advancing humans. In the chaos, a small team of human scouts slipped through the perimeter. They moved with the fluid coordination of long practice, covering each other as they leapfrogged from cover to cover. Their objective was the command post's comms array, the nerve center of the Breen's battlefield network. They reached the base of the array, a looming spire studded with transmission dishes and signal boosters. The lead scout pulled a demo charge from his pack, priming the detonator. He slapped it onto the array's main support strut, then gave a hand signal. The team fell back, taking cover behind a burnt-out Breen assault shuttle. Moments later, the charge detonated. The comms array disappeared in a blinding flash, a thunderclap that rolled across the battlefield. The spire toppled, crashing down in a tangle of twisted metal and sparking cables. With the array destroyed, the Breen's command and control dissolved into a snarl of static and garbled orders. The Dronok's warriors, already reeling from the psychic assault, fell into total disarray. Some stood motionless, as if waiting for orders that would never come. Others milled about in confusion, easy prey for the advancing humans and dire wolves. But high above on the flagship's bridge, Warlord Zalax gazed at the unfolding disaster with cold, implacable eyes. The humans had wounded his swarm, shattered the unity of the hive mind. But they had not broken him, and he would make them pay for this affront, even if he had to rip their worlds apart with his own claws. He turned to his warriors, his voice a rasp of steel on bone. "Prepare a landing party. We will take this fight to the humans, and we will crush them underfoot like the vermin they are." The warriors saluted, fists thumping against chitinous chests. They would follow their lord into the very jaws of hell for the glory of the swarm. On the planet's surface, Bruce and his team regrouped with the colonial defenders. They had won a victory, but Bruce knew it was only the beginning. Zalax would not let this stand. He would come for them, with all the fury of the hive behind him. They had to be ready, for the true battle for Zephyria, for the very future of humanity on this world, was about to begin. Bruce looked to the stars, where the shattered remnants of the Breen fleet hung like a promise of retribution. Somewhere up there Zalax was watching, waiting, and Bruce knew with a cold certainty that the warlord would not rest until he had the human's head on a pike. The thought brought a grim smile to Bruce's face. Let him come. The humans would be waiting, and this time they wouldn't be fighting for survival. They'd be fighting to end the Breen threat, once and for all. Bruce hefted his plasma rifle, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was a good weight. The weight of hope, of defiance in the face of annihilation. Around him, the survivors of Zephyria gathered, soldiers and civilians, men and women, all united by the bonds of shared struggle and sacrifice. They looked to him, their eyes alight with a fierce, unyielding determination. These were his people, his to lead, his to protect, and he would not fail them. "Sakur!" With a savage snarl, Odin leapt at the nearest Breen guard, his massive jaws clamping down on the insectoid's neck. Chitin cracked and ichor sprayed as the dire wolf wrenched his head, ripping out the guard's throat. The rest of the Fenris pack surged forward, a tide of fur and fang, tearing into the Breen with ruthless efficiency. Bruce and Jake pressed on, blasting their way through the dwindling defenders. The bridge doors loomed ahead, heavily reinforced and thrumming with energy. Bruce slapped a breaching charge on the lock, priming the detonator. He nodded to Jake, who took up position on the other side of the door, his jury-rigged psionic disruptor at the ready. The charge blew, shredding the doors. Bruce and Jake stormed onto the bridge, weapons raised, and there in the center of the chaos stood Warlord Zalax. The Breen leader was a titan, towering over his subordinates. His exoskeleton was a matte black, adorned with vicious spikes and serrated edges. His compound eyes blazed with malevolent intelligence, fixing on the intruders with a look of pure, seething hatred. "Humans," Zalax spat, his voice a rasping hiss. "You dare to invade my ship? To disrupt the sacred harmony of the hive mind? You will pay for this affront with your lives." He lunged, moving with blinding speed for a creature his size. His razor-sharp mandibles snapped at Bruce's head, barely missing as the human ducked and rolled. Jake fired his disruptor, a pulse of psionic static that made Zalax recoil, his mental defenses momentarily breached. Bruce pressed the advantage, his anti-Breen rifle spitting plasma. But Zalax's armor was strong, the bolt splashing off his carapace with little effect. The warlord retaliated with a sweep of his taloned claws, catching Bruce across the chest, sending him flying. Jake moved to flank, deploying a psionic resonator. The device emitted a piercing whine, scrambling the mental frequencies of the Breen in the room. Drones collapsed, clutching at their heads, but Zalax stood firm, his will an iron bastion. Odin and his wolves fell upon the incapacitated drones, jaws crushing, claws rending. The bridge ran slick with insectoid blood, but more Breen poured in from adjoining corridors, a chitinous tide of reinforcements. Amid the carnage, Zalax and Bruce clashed, a whirlwind of chitin and flex steel. Bruce's armor absorbed the worst of the blows, but he was tiring, his reflexes slowing. Zalax seemed inexhaustible, driven by a bottomless well of rage and hate. The deck shuddered beneath their feet. the distant thunder of explosions reverberating through the hull. The sabotage team had done its work. The flagship was crippled, its offensive capabilities neutralized. But the cost had been high, the team cut off and overrun by Breen kill squads. And still Xalax fought on, an implacable engine of destruction. He had Bruce on the back foot, driving him across the bridge with a relentless onslaught. Jake tried to intervene, to draw the warlord's attention, but Xalax was too fast, too strong. A backhand blow sent Jake sprawling, his psionic disruptor skittering across the deck. In a last desperate gambit, Xalax activated a hidden psionic amplifier built into his armor. A sickening wave of mental force rolled out from him, targeting the minds of the humans. Bruce and Jake staggered, their thoughts fragmenting, their will to fight draining away. But Jake, even dazed, had one last trick up his sleeve. With a shaking hand he reached out to his fallen disruptor, activating its emergency failsafe, a feedback loop that would turn Xalax's own psionic assault back on him. The device hummed, glowed, and then unleashed a scintillating burst of mental energy. It collided with Xalax's amplified psionic wave, the two forces grappling, intertwining, each seeking to overwhelm the other. Jake focused all his will, all his mental discipline into the disruptor. He pictured his mind as an impenetrable wall, a reflection of Xalax's own attack. With a cry of effort, he pushed back against the warlord's onslaught, the veins standing out on his forehead, blood trickling from his nose. In the eye of this psychic storm, Bruce struggled to his feet, his rifle leveled at Xalax's head. The warlord was locked in place, every iota of his concentration bent on the mental duel with Jake. He didn't see Bruce's finger tighten on the trigger, didn't hear the whine of the plasma coils reaching maximum charge. The bolt took Xalax square in the temple, burning through his exoskeleton, boiling his brain in its chitinous shell. The warlord convulsed, his psionic amplifier overloading, feedback arcing across his body. With a final agonized shriek, he collapsed, smoke rising from his eye sockets. The humans had won. The flagship was theirs. But as Bruce surveyed the devastation, the fallen forms of friends and foes alike, he knew their victory had come at a terrible price. The war was far from over, and the Breen would be hungry for revenge. But Bruce's will was iron, forged in the crucible of 100 battles. He gritted his teeth, blood trickling from his nose, as he pushed back against Xalax's psychic onslaught. His mind was a fortress, unyielding, unbreakable. "Is that all you got, Bug?" he snarled, his voice strained but defiant. Xalax chittered in rage, his attack redoubling. But Bruce would not fall, not here, not now. He had a world to save, a species to protect, and he'd be damned if he'd let this overgrown insect break him. Beside him, Odin and his wolves tore into the last of the Breen guards, a whirlwind of claws and fangs. The alpha wolf moved with a fluid grace belying his size, his movements perfectly synchronized with Bruce's own. It was as if the beast could read his mind, anticipate his every action. The Breen soldiers fell like wheat before a scythe, their exoskeletons no match for the dire wolves' savage strength. Odin ripped the head from the final guard, his muzzle dripping with ichor. He turned to Bruce, his eyes alight with a fierce, almost human intelligence. Bruce nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared, the trust forged in blood and fire. Together they advanced on Xalax, the warlord now standing alone amidst the carnage. In the psionic realm, Jake battled on, his mind a tempest of human ingenuity and resolve. He battered at Xalax's defenses, seeking the cracks in the Breen's mental armor, and there, in the depths of the warlord's psyche, he found it, a memory, a fleeting image. Towering hatcheries, pulsing with a sickly green light, row upon row of incubation pods, each one housing a developing Breen warrior, a location seared into Xalax's mind, the heart of the Breen's war machine, the key to their domination. Jake latched onto the memory, his psionic probe worming deeper, extracting every scrap of information, coordinates, defenses, troop numbers. He had it all. With this knowledge, they could strike a blow that the Breen would never recover from. But Zalax sensed the intrusion, his rage boiling over. With a psychic roar, he ripped Jake from his mind, hurling him back into his own body. Jake staggered, blood streaming from his eyes and ears. Bruce saw his brother falter, saw the triumph and pain etched on his face. He didn't need to ask if Jake had found what they needed. He could see it in his eyes. Zalax loomed before them, his psionic power crackling around him like a storm. His eyes blazed with madness and hate, his mind a maelstrom of thwarted ambition and wounded pride. He lashed out with a final desperate blast of psionic energy, the air shimmering with the force of his will. Bruce and Jake staggered, their minds battered by the psychic onslaught. Odin howled in pain, his eyes rolling back in his skull. But they would not yield. They would not break. They were human and dire wolf. They were the guardians of Earth, the protectors of Zephyria, and they would fight to their last breath. With a roar of defiance, Bruce charged, his anti-breen weapon blazing. Jake unleashed a psionic counterattack, his mind a lance of pure, indomitable will. And Odin, the great Alpha, leapt for Zalax's throat, his jaws wide and slavering. The battle for the future of two species had reached its climax, and only one side would emerge victorious. The fate of worlds hung in the balance, and the scales were tipping. But even as he grappled with Korvac, a flicker of movement caught Bruce's eye. A group of ragged figures darted across the war-torn deck, dodging blasts of plasma and showers of chitin. Bruce's heart leapt as he recognized the lead figure. Jake, his brother, long thought lost to the Breen. The prisoners he'd freed were making a break for the escape pods. Jake paused, looking back at Bruce. Their eyes met across the chaos. A lifetime of unspoken words passed between them. Then Jake held up a hand, something glinting in his grasp. Bruce squinted. It was a vial, filled with a strange, luminous liquid. Jake mimed throwing it, then pointed at Korvac. His meaning was clear. With a final nod, Jake turned and sprinted after the other prisoners. Bruce knew his brother was a genius xenobiologist. If anyone could find a chink in the Breen's armor, literally or figuratively, it was Jake. But to do that, he needed a sample of Korvac herself, and Bruce was going to get it for him. Gritting his teeth against the psionic onslaught, Bruce lunged at Korvac, feinting high then slashing low. His blade bit into her thorax, ichor spraying. The queen shrieked in pain and rage. Her mind blast redoubled, threatening to pulverize Bruce's brain within his skull. He staggered, vision blurring, the knife falling from nerveless fingers. Korvac loomed over him, her mandibles dripping venom. She raised her talons for the killing blow. Bruce closed his eyes, preparing for the end. But the blow never fell. A deafening roar shook the chamber as the far wall exploded inward. Shards of metal scythed through the air, and through the smoke and fire, a monstrous shape emerged. Odin had arrived. The Alpha Warbeast was a titan, all fangs and fury. His claws gouged the deck, his jaws slavered. His eyes, one milky with scar tissue, the other filled with feral cunning, fixed on Korvac. He had the scent of his prey. Behind him, the rest of the Fenris pack poured into the chamber, a tide of engineered killing machines. They fell upon the Dronox with savage glee, ripping and tearing with brutal efficiency. Breen warriors were shredded like paper, their weapons useless against the Warbeast's hide. Korvac spun to face this new threat, mandibles clacking in disbelief. Her control over the Dronox faltered as the mental feedback from their violent deaths slammed into her mind. She lashed out with a psionic shockwave, trying to crush the Warbeast's simple minds. But Odin was no mere beast. He was the product of Earth's most advanced military science, his brain enhanced to near-human levels. Korvac's mental blast broke upon his iron will like water on rock. With a snarl, he launched himself at the Queen, claws outstretched. As the Titans clashed, Bruce dragged himself across the deck inch by painful inch. His head pounded, his vision swam, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Jake needed that sample. There, Korvac's ichor splattered on the deck. With a trembling hand, Bruce scooped a gobbet of the viscous fluid into an empty shell casing. It would have to do. He had to get this to Jake, and pray his brother could work a miracle. Clutching his prize, Bruce staggered toward the escape pods where he'd seen Jake and the others flee. Behind him, Odin and Korvac raged, two apex predators locked in mortal combat. The fate of Zephyria would be decided here, in blood and fire. Bruce tumbled into the escape pod, his strength spent. Jake was there, helping him, taking the shell casing. The doors slammed shut. The pod blasted free of the disintegrating mothership. And on the planet below, the tide of battle turned as the Fenris pack fell upon the Breen like the wrath of old Earth. The Breen's coordination crumbled without Korvac's focused will. The Warbeasts' savagery was unstoppable. Dronok's warriors fell by the score, their hive mind thrown into chaos. In the makeshift lab of the human HQ, Jake worked feverishly, synthesizing, testing, praying. Bruce's sample was the key. The Breen's weakness, hidden in their genetic code, a vulnerability to a rare Earth compound. A poison to the Breen, harmless to humans. Within hours, the skies of Zephyria darkened with dropships as Earth forces rained from orbit. Every soldier was armed with Jake's miracle weapon, chemical bombs and armor-piercing rounds laced with the Breen bane. The Breen's exoskeletons crumbled like sand. Their ships dissolved in mid-air. The Dronoks died in droves, their bodies rejecting their own poisoned flesh. It was a rout, a slaughter. Zephyria ran red with insectoid ichor, and leading the charge, baying for alien blood, was the Fenris pack. Odin had returned alone, his fur matted with the Queen's gore. Korvac was no more. The hive mind was broken. The Breen were beaten. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.